So, a bit of a while back, I was speaking to my colleague and she asked me if chivalry was dead. Now, I can't remember the answer that I gave, but thinking about it a little later on, and I sort of came to the conclusion that chivalry itself didn't die, it just grew with the times, if I can call it that. And I want to explain exactly why I believe that, but that's gonna come later on in the episode because I have a bunch of other things to talk about, like, events and Christian porn and shit like that. But I will get to all of that because that's supposed to come even before the whole chivalry talk. But before I do all of that, I wanted to talk about a double-headed issue for a little bit. Now, there was a story of some conjoined twins that I found to be particularly interesting because they happen to be conjoined, they share vagina, but only one of them has a boyfriend while the other identifies as asexual or asexual. I don't know if that's how you'll say it. Now, the interesting thing about this story isn't actually the fact that these twins are conjoined, because I think that probably would have seemed like the most interesting part. It's the fact that one of them is dating, because the guy that is dating her is probably in one of the best positions on the planet because, as the proverb itself says, 2 heads are better than 1.
Get ready for the battle of the sexes.
Okay, maybe I was stretching that proverb a little bit, but when you kind of look at the story, it does actually kind of reflect that, even though one of them is supposedly asexual. But let me just read the story for you real quick before I get into everything. So the story reads, and I quote, Lupita and Carmen share a unique physical connection but have their own individual desires and preferences. While Lupita identifies as asexual and isn't interested in dating, Carmen set up a Hinge profile in October 2020. Despite receiving many messages from guys with fetishes, she found someone who saw her beyond her physical condition. Daniel didn't ask about her conjoined twin status, and that made all the difference. Carmen felt nervous before previous dates, but with Daniel, she felt a sense of calm and excitement. End quote. Now, having read this, first of all, I think most of the other guys were probably a little too direct because it just clearly showed that they had fetishes. But clearly this Daniel dude decided to play the long game because if he is getting head from one shorty, it's like the other one probably has to watch, or maybe the other one will be licking the balls or some shit. Like, I'm just trying to think about this from his perspective because he is dating one babe, but he's dating 2 babes at the same time. But on the flip side, it's not like they have 2 different vaginas. So for any of you that are asking, it's not like he's getting twice the pussy. He's just getting twice the head, even though one of them isn't particularly going to give him head. Although my question now is, if Carmen wanted to shag, but Lupita wasn't into it, would you say that it's a situation of rape, considering that it's one body and one head refused but the other one accepted? Because I don't know if the whole bounds of consent work with them. Because this other babe is asexual. This other babe clearly wants to have some sort of a relationship. Daniel lives in the 21st century of right now, so he might want pussy at some point. So does this other babe enjoy free pussy, or does she turn it down and mean that none of them actually get to do shit? Like, I don't know how shit like that would work. And I think if I was on weed, this would be one of those questions that would occupy my entire time getting high, of which, since I'm not and I am doing this podcast, I should be attending to other things that I should have known how to figure out, like how to start this episode, because I had nothing besides this normal thing that I say, which is, welcome to Breaktime on West Side, your number 1 Breaktime podcast, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. The man on the mic is a man who likes 2 conjoined twins, normally on a woman's back end, and that is referred to as booty. Those are the conjoined twins that I like. Maybe tits, but mostly booty. He's a man who recently removed jumping to conclusions from his cardio routine. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. The show is Battle of the Sexes, our weekly love, sex, and relationships show where I get to talk about twins, I get to fantasize about them shagging, but usually, whilst that might not be the main topic, I usually like to come through with a conclusion at the end of the episode for one reason or another. And while you are entitled to your opinion on twins, you also are entitled to your opinion in terms of every other thing on the podcast, and I do encourage you to give feedback. whether it's speaking on the topic that was on the podcast or even suggesting a topic that should be on the podcast, you should give your feedback, and you can do that via our social media handles, which are usually in the description. At Breaktime on Westside on Facebook, at Breaktime on Westside on IG. The DMs are always open. On Twitter, you can slide into my personal DMs, which is at BagakaTheD, and I would be more than happy to see and respond to your many DMs. Now, a huge shout out to each and every one of you that listens, a huge shout out to each and every one of you that shares, and an especially big shout out to those of you that give feedback. I really appreciate that shit. And we should probably be moving on to our main topic, but as usual, before we do that, there's a couple of things that I wanted us to talk about. This time, it's not just one thing, it's two. The first thing is Boys to Men. Now, of course, if you're in Kenya or if you're in Nairobi or if you're pretty aware, Boys to Men are supposed to be coming around the beginning of June. Alright, there's a Boys to Men concert that's happening in Nairobi, and it was this super hyped thing that came out, I guess, at the beginning of this month, which was about 2 weeks ago. And VVIP was 30,000, VIP was 15,000, and regular was 8,000 for entrance. Now, the interesting thing is that VVIP is the one that actually sold out first, because it sold out in about 4, maybe 5 days, and VIP sold out about 2 days after. So in about a week, VVIP and VIP were sold out. So the most expensive seats. Regular, all the way till now, 2 weeks down the line, is still open, which raises a bunch of questions for me, because normally you'd expect that people would go ahead buy the regulars or the VIPs, and VVIPs, it's very few people would get. And I can understand why probably VVIP can fill up very quickly. It's very few slots and probably the parks are way more, like backstage access and shit. But you're telling me that regular is still running, and yet the most expensive tickets have already been sold out? Like, either you're telling me that all the people with the money are paying and it's only the people that are struggling to get 8,000 pay for a ticket that are left, or these guys are probably increasing the number of slots for regular people just so that they can get more money from the event. That's my personal thoughts on it, but honestly, I feel like if it's been running for this entire time and it's not completely finished, especially with the cheapest tickets being 8,000, then there's probably someone who's making sure that they're not spending, or there's a couple of people that are just trying to play around and they might give regular people a very substandard experience. But either way, those are just my thoughts on it. But moving things on, there is an OnlyFans model based off of LA who recently came out to state that she feels more connected to her faith since she began her OnlyFans career, which is very weird. And interestingly enough, this is a Christian. So you know that some shit's about to get wild right about now. Now, apparently, this so-called Christian porn star has been saying that God's message has been abundantly clear. I am here to be a porn star and this is my way of serving. Now, she said that when she was being interviewed not too long ago, and I found that to be particularly interesting because on one end, while I can't say that there's a Bible verse that says that sex has to be done in private, on the other side, considering that she's a quote-unquote porn star, you can technically say that what she's doing is prostitution, which isn't entirely encouraged in the Bible. So I don't entirely get how she's supposedly doing this, or at least she's finding her purpose in it, and her Christian side is particularly satisfied. And I'll read you a small portion of the article because it says, and I quote, "The 35-year-old woman, Courtney Talia, revealed her revelation during an interview with the Daily Star. She said, and I quote, God's message has been abundantly clear. I'm here to be a porn star. This is my way of serving." End quote. Talia, who has 4 children, was initially a high school educator. However, she believed her life lacked meaning in the field of education, and she wasn't serving a higher purpose, ultimately causing her spirituality to suffer. Back in 2016, the woman cultivated her OnlyFans account with support from her husband. First, she was ashamed of her account. However, she later realized her strict spiritual upbringing was causing that guilt. She later realized that her newfound job was God's plan for her life. She added, and I quote, "I now reject any teaching or institution that depicts God as an entity to be feared or judged by. God is loving, not fearful, and accepting, not judgmental." End quote. In 2021, the OnlyFans content creator told the New York Post that she created a quote-unquote life coaching business to help other women embrace their sexuality. End of story. Now, the interesting part about this is I'm trying to look at it, and considering that she was previously a teacher, like the simplest way that you can say that her career transition made sense is, she traded in handling kids for handling kids, just a different way. But still, you kind of have to think about it. You can say that your spirituality was a little bit lacking, but how is it that it's become more fulfilled when you've gotten into the industry of selling sex, particularly, and you've left the opportunity to coach the next generation of possible young leaders, citizens, and civilians, and that's what's given you an increase in spiritual satisfaction? Like, that shit don't make sense to me at all. It makes absolutely fuck all sense to me. And while I personally don't care about her Christian status, the rest of it, like the entire talk around it, just doesn't seem to make sense, because embracing your sexuality as a woman through OnlyFans doesn't particularly sound like anything more than a coaching on sex work from someone who's just very religious. To which I'd probably tell you the best person to speak to in that category is probably Black China, because she recently became more religious, but at the same time stopped her OnlyFans business, which she had been running for like 4 or 5 years or some shit. But anyways, considering that she has a husband and the husband is particularly supportive, I don't think there's that much that we can say that can really deter her. Because at the end of the day, if dude is helping enjoy the money, then by all means, it's not really our problem. But I am going to leave it at that, because we do have a main topic to discuss and move things on. Now, about 2 and something weeks ago, I stumbled onto a very interesting video from a babe that was busy talking about men today and how they're supposed to be treating babes in a certain kind of way. And she used a term that I found to be particularly common but very, very uninteresting. Now I'm gonna play the clip for you and then we can get into it, because I have a couple of breakdowns beyond that. So without further ado,
so both Charlene and I, in the span of a week, invited men over and on separate occasions, okay? And at the time we didn't have a TV stand, we were working on getting one, okay? But both of these men had something to say about our TV being on the floor. So you know what we did? Immediately bought a TV stand.
Period.
Then we got another man to come over and put together the TV stand.
Because he's a real man that builds shit and minds his business.
He brought his own toolbox, didn't ask for nothing, got a glass of water, was respectful the entire time. Shout out to him.
He got snacks too. We're not like on hospital.
He got snacks.
We gave him some snacks.
But he didn't ask for anything in exchange, is the point. Because he genuinely wanted to help. And that's why men like that win in life.
Period. Shout out to you, Raw Vintage.
okay. First of all, before I say anything on this, I'm just gonna give the disclaimer that just because you've done something for a babe doesn't mean that she owes you a shag, and just because you go out of your way to help a babe does not mean that she is automatically supposed to give you sex. That is something that I just wanted to start off by saying, so that people don't come out and they're like, oh Denver, you sound like you just want to do things if you only promised a shot. No, I feel like this is very self-explanatory, and if I give that disclaimer first of all, then at least it gives me a chance to talk about the other things. Because there was something that particularly pissed me off about this video, and it's not what the guy did, it's not what the babes were saying per se. It's the idea of the quote-unquote real man. Because I've been hearing it quite a lot, and babes have used that term for a very long time. This whole thing of saying a real man does this, a real man does that, or real men are supposed to be blah blah blah. Like, you hear this shit said so much, and it's a term that gets tossed around all the time. And I've never really understood why it is that babes like to say that. But furthermore, it's just the way it's normally used. Because there's a very, very particular way that it's used, and a lot of guys that spend a lot of time online probably notice this. But every single time you hear the term real men being used, it's usually in relation to something that benefits a babe. Like, you normally hear that, and 90% of the time it's usually used by women because they're talking about some shit that they wish a guy would do for them. Then like 5% of the time it's usually used up by guys that are trying to appeal to women, and the other 5% is usually used up by guys that are particularly capable of something, so they term that incapability to not be attributed to real men. So for example, if you make a ton of money, you're busy saying that a real man should be able to provide fully for his babe, and you don't pay attention to the fact that your situation doesn't apply to every other guy, and as such it's not like every other guy can actually manage to fully provide for a woman and children, at least not today for everyone. But all in all, it's mostly just stuff that appeals to babes, or stuff that babes want because it means that they don't have to do as much and the man can sort of take up the burden for them. And in some ways it's almost used as a shaming tactic of sorts, because I never usually see babes just pull that out of their ass and just use it randomly out of nowhere, not unless if they're making other men who don't want to do the same thing feel bad for not doing it. And it honestly does start to sound like a bit of a malicious term, because I have never heard a babe, and I kid you not, in all of my years of podcasting, hell, all of my years of existence, I have never heard a babe saying that a real man is supposed to come home and sit down while me, the wife, who has had a long day at work, comes home and cooks food for them. Nah, I have never heard a babe say some shit like that. And you want to know why? Because that is some shit that would put her in the burden spot and the man in the position to just chill and enjoy themselves. But guess what? They'll be very ready to say that a real man should be able to make you breakfast in bed. A real man should be able to provide for you fully. A real man is supposed to, do shit like get down and dirty for you without expecting anything in return. Like, a lot of that shit is what you hear very commonly. And at some point, I actually started to notice something very interesting whenever women were busy saying real men do this, real men do that. And I realized that every single thing that women normally say real men do or real men don't do is usually sort of tied to what used to be referred to back in the day as chivalry. Yes, chivalry. Like, you listen to a lot of what babes expect you to do, and a lot of women used to tie that shit to chivalry. So stuff like opening the car door, stuff like, covering her up and you getting rained on, stuff like you being able to cover the bill, stuff like you being able to do certain tasks for her. Like, a lot of that shit, which nowadays, I guess maybe with the exception of having a lot of money, is all sort of tied to the whole terminology of real men. And while a lot of women will use the term real men, there are still some that speak of the idea of chivalry and it being dead, which is particularly interesting because when you kind of think about it, it's a little bit hard to actually decipher whether chivalry really did die. At least the way I'm sort of looking at it. Because when people talk about chivalry, like when babes talk about chivalry, it's this whole like old knighthood concept where you're supposed to treat a woman with respect and you make sure that her life is as comfortable as possible and that she doesn't go through any suffering, all with the idea of seeming like this particularly great guy. And when I listen to a lot of babes talking about how chivalry is supposedly dead and when chivalry died or who killed it, you kind of have to look at it and ask yourself, if chivalry really was to die, was it really the guys who killed it or was it the babes? Because when you think about it, it's not like men stopped being chivalrous for nothing. It's because we simply realized that you could get a babe without particularly being chivalrous. And to kind of trace that back to its roots, that would have to go all the way back to the whole, the invention of the pill and the sexual revolution, from like the 60s and shit. And you actually start to realize that chivalry itself, if it was killed, it wasn't killed by the guys. And it's very easy to prove that. At the end of the day, when you kind of look at it, most guys weren't really experiencing sex until they got married, alright? And they would have to be chivalrous so that they could get to that position where they are marriage material, so that they could get married and finally have sex. Now, if you take sex and you bring it till the before the marriage situation, then it means that I don't have to marry you to sleep with you. And when that happens, then it means that not only can good guys get some, but bad guys, or should I say bad boys, can also get the same thing, of which the people that seem to be getting it the most are the so-called bad boys. So the question that I have to ask is, if I am busy trying to be nice to you, trying to cozy up to you because I think you're attractive and I really like you and I believe that, being noble would appeal to you so much, and yet there's a guy that does not give a shit about you, that can probably treat you like shit, is getting some, do you really think that I would stick to chivalry? Huh? Like, you kind of have to think about it in a little bit of a smart way, because if you actually think it through, the treatment that men will give women will run in parallel with the length of time that the same men will get before they can actually get sex. And you actually sort of notice that particularly well, because if you look at, say, the Muslims, who pretty much had to abstain all the way till they got married, they treated babes a certain way, or at least they treated Muslim babes a certain way, up until they got married. And then now you'd see their true colors. You look at dudes out here who can bang a babe today after meeting them today, and you look at how they treat babes, and you actually realize that whatever chivalrous good treatment that they'd have given them, they probably won't give them, because they know they don't have to do that to get pussy. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, was it really the guys that actually killed chivalry, or it was the fact that the babes were just giving it to guys that didn't have to treat them well to get some? So at the end of the day, the benefits that the practitioner of chivalry will get today will be far outweighed by the benefits that are gotten by the person that acts in direct opposition to how chivalry is. So essentially, you're just getting more if you're anything but chivalrous. So should guys really settle down for the thing that gives them the least amount of benefit? And at the end of the day, is it particularly useful for guys? Because while some babes are gonna be like, being chivalrous is being good, you kind of think about it, if you're being chivalrous and you're going out of your way to help a fine babe because you really like her and she's fine and shit and you believe in chivalry, so you should help her out, is it really that you're being nice? Is it really that it's a good thing? Or is it just the fact that this babe is fine, so she's taking advantage of your liking to her? Like, at the end of the day, is that a good thing for you as a guy? Because if there's nothing useful in it, at least for you as a guy, and there's no real benefits to it, then why should we let it live? Which kind of goes back to the question that I started this podcast with, which was, is chivalry dead? Which, now to conclude all of this, I don't think it particularly died. Because in some ways, you think about it, guys will still treat babes well. And it's usually not just for the shag, but when you think about it, back in the day, a lot of guys were chivalrous not because they were genuinely nice people, but because they wanted to get the goods from a babe and they wanted a good reputation as a good man to actually sort of precede them, such that it becomes easier for them to attract a mate. Because the whole idea of being noble actually worked for the women that were there during that time. But today, that's not the case. You treat a woman nicely and you very, very easily fall into this very, very slippery slope of possibly becoming a simp. And if that's the case, then you're probably going to end up being friend zoned, while the person that treated her a little bit more like shit probably has a much better shot. So all in all, it's not that chivalry itself died, it just grew with the certain demands and the times that it currently has right now. Because back then, for you to get a woman, you needed to be seen as a good man, which required you to treat women well, which was considered chivalrous. But if you don't need to treat a babe well, but you'll still get the same result if you just decide to be yourself and not give too much of a shit, then will you really say that chivalry itself has died? Because honestly, I think it just traded in the oversized 3-piece suit for a t-shirt and some sweatpants because it realized that you didn't need the suit to get the woman. You can get them with a couple of sweatpants because I guess dick prints work pretty well for babes nowadays. Although, then again, I might be wrong about this entire thing, so I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on Facebook, on IG, it is at Breaktime on Westside, on Twitter, it is at Bagaka the D. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.